Well, this is the video podcast conversation for Multifaith Matters, and I'm privileged today to have as my guest David Livingstone Smith. I've appreciated his work in the past. I've read one of his prior books, and I'll be talking about that in just a moment. We're going to be talking today about content from his most recent book, On Inhumanity, and I'm going to read his bio from the inside cover of that. David Livingstone Smith is professor of philosophy at the University of New England in Bedford, Maine. He has written or edited 9 books, including On Inhumanity, including Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others, that was published by St. Martin's Press in 2011. And it was that prior book that first put David on my radar, and I was excited to see his follow-up volume on Inhumanity. And today we're going to talk to him about dehumanization in the context of evangelicals and multi-faith engagement, primarily in the American context. David, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you for having me here.
Let's begin by defining our subject matter. What do you mean by dehumanization?
Yeah, so the word dehumanization entered the English language in the early 19th century, around 1819. And it's used to mean lots and lots of different things. So if you Google it, you'll find literally millions of hits. And then if you go to those, you'll find that the word is used in lots of different ways. Sometimes we use it just to describe something that we think is wrong or bad, wrong treatment or bad treatment of others, or the use of certain sorts of slurs and so on. I use the word dehumanization in a very particular way, which is to refer to a kind of attitude. And that attitude is looking down on others as less than human creatures. So you're sort of expelling them from the category of the human and thinking of them as subhumans.
Now, viewers may be wondering why we're talking about this topic in the context of multi-faith encounters with evangelicals. Just by way of background, I mentioned before you and I started this conversation here in the podcast that I did 5 years worth of grant research through the Louisville Institute, and 2 of those years included looking at social psychology and social neuroscience. And during that process, it was dehumanization that showed up on the radar for me, and I was intrigued. And I think this needs to be a part of the broader evangelical conversation. So my hope is that whether you're a pastor or just somebody sitting in the pew, that we can look at this uncomfortable topic and realize how it is a problem in our society and for evangelicals and other Christians, not just in the past, but in the present. So I appreciate you being here to help us unpack that and having defined it for us. Can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in this subject of studying and researching and writing on it? Now 2 books on the subject.
Yeah, well, that has 2 sides. So one side has to do with my personal history, my history as a human being. I grew up in the Deep South in the 1950s and 60s. My parents moved from New York to Southwest Florida, which back in the day was really Deep South culturally. And this was a world in which I didn't quite fit in. So if I can give you a little bit of background.
Sure.
My mother was Jewish. Her parents were Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. My father came from an old Southern missionary family. In fact, he was born to missionaries in Brazil. So this world of the Deep South was quite comfortable for him, less comfortable for my mother. Now, this was the days of segregation. There was brutal racism all around, and it was not something you had to, infer the existence of. It was quite blatant and explicit. And as a little kid, I had to make sense of this. And as a child, when you see a sign on the beach saying dogs and Negroes not allowed, it just seems wrong, right? Mm-hmm. It just seems wrong. Now, in that task of understanding this world was greatly helped by my maternal grandparents. So my maternal grandparents would come and visit us in the summers in Florida. They lived in New York and eventually moved down. So I spent a lot of my childhood in this extended family with my maternal grandparents. And my grandmother in particular was a brilliant, self-educated woman. You know, although she had to leave school at around the age of 14 to work to help support herself and her brothers, she 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 was just astonishing. And one thing she knew a great deal about are some of the darker sides of history, the history of anti-Semitism, of the extermination of Native Americans, and the brutal oppression of African Americans. And she explained a lot of that to me. And so, you know, as I grew and I eventually stumbled into being a philosopher, I carried that experience with me. Now, that's the one of the two sides. The other side is I was working on a book around about 2006 on war and human nature called The Most Dangerous Animal. And when I was working on that book, I came across all this wartime propaganda, dehumanizing propaganda, propaganda that presented the enemy not as a fellow human being, but as vermin or dangerous predators or things of that nature. And I discovered that this phenomenon, dehumanization, was really not dealt with anywhere much outside of social psychology. And I was not entirely satisfied with what the social psychologists were saying about it. So a friend convinced me to write a book. And that was my 2011 Less Than Human book, which was the first single-authored book, I think still, well, now one of two single-authored books on dehumanization in the English language. And I've been studying it ever since because I think it's, you know, dehumanization is bound up with the most terrible things we do to other human beings. We look at genocide, we look at war, we look at the atrocities that unfortunately human beings have perpetrated on one another and which litter our history. Dehumanization is very, very often a significant contributing factor. So I'm still on it. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, and it's work which is becoming increasingly pressing and serious, given the trajectory that the world is taking.
Unfortunately. Well, you've defined it for us. It's moved from the more abstract to the more concrete to give people some examples to get their minds around. Can you share a few examples historically of dehumanization,
Sure.
things that people may be familiar with and maybe they're not?
Sure. So let me give you two examples. One, at least in the aspect I'm going to describe it, a little bit distant in history, but not in geography. And the other happening now. So the first one, which I use a lot as an example when I'm talking about dehumanization, is the attitudes of many white Americans to Black Americans, particularly Black American men, in the aftermath of the failure of Reconstruction in the late 19th century. So, you know, Reconstruction, basically federal troops move into the South to protect the enslaved people who were now freed, at least ostensibly. And a deal was struck, the outcome of a contested presidential election, and that led to the federal troops leaving. And it led to Black people in the South being effectively re-enslaved through various means. Now, during this period, now from, let's say, well, let's say from 1890 into well up into the 20th century, lynching was widely practiced. 3/4 of the victims of lynching were Black people lynched by white people. And lynching is something which most Americans don't quite understand because they're normally exposed to how it's presented in the movies and on TV. And that's very, very sanitized. So what lynching really involved, almost always, was bodily mutilation, hours of torture, and then execution. Now, my research focuses on what's called spectacle lynchings. Spectacle lynchings were lynchings attended by thousands of spectators. They were treated as festive occasions. Whole families would come to watch a human being being tortured for hours, and then typically, well, not necessarily typically, but very often burnt alive at the end. And I can't stress too much how these were regarded as festivals. In fact, one scholar has compared them to rituals of human sacrifice. Schools were closed, bars were closed, railroad companies laid on extra trains to transport spectators. Body parts were taken as souvenirs and sometimes handed down in a family for generations. Professional photographers were on hand to photograph the event, and these photographs were sold as postcards. It's horrible beyond belief. What interests me is how these events were described and how they were represented in the press, particularly the Southern press, but not exclusively the Southern press. So they were described often as barbecues. So when a human being was burned to death, it was a barbecue. And that tells us right away that the victim is seen as less than human. Mm-hmm. But in the press, we find the victims described as monsters, as beasts, and very often as demonic beings, as monsters and demons and fiends, and so on. So there's an image of the victim as less than human, as subhuman. And see, that has a function, and this is so important. The way I think about dehumanization is in relation to a feature of human nature. And that is that it's actually not that easy for us to do this sort of harm to others. We have inner obstacles. That's part of being a human being. So, to look into someone's eyes and kill them is very, very hard to. And for most people, if they're in a position where they have to do that, it harms them. It haunts them for a lifetime. There are always a few that don't care. So dehumanization is a way that human beings have developed over thousands of years to sort of short circuit that response that prevents us from doing these sorts of things to our fellow human beings. Right. So in presenting Black people, particularly Black men, as less than human beings, what that did was it freed people up to perform these acts and legitimated them. I mean, if they're monsters and demons, it's our responsibility to dispatch them, right? Mm-hmm. They're evil, they're bad to the bone, they're evil beings. And that's very, very often how dehumanization works. And certainly the most toxic forms of dehumanization, which I call demonizing dehumanization, we find these elements in place. So that's one. And, this image of the demonic person, the demonic Black man you don't have to use the word demon to demonize someone. Right. So nowadays it's often cast in the form of criminality, essentially criminal people. That's like a secular version of demon and demonic. So the other example I wanted to give was the genocide in Myanmar. And this genocide, or ethnic cleansing, some people prefer to call it, involved all of the atrocities that we associate with genocide. You know, torture, whole-scale murder, rape, and the movement of populations. You know, so refugees moving into these terrible refugee camps, the largest in the world. It's people from Myanmar. And this was largely perpetrated by militant Buddhist monks. So I know, because I'm speaking to evangelicals, I want to emphasize that religion doesn't keep you from getting your hands dirty here.
Mm-hmm.
So in the American South, it was, overwhelmingly Christian, right?
Right.
The South then, as now, is overwhelmingly Christian. In Myanmar, it was and is radical Buddhist monks who dehumanized the Muslim minority. So in Myanmar, the westernmost state of Myanmar is called Rakhine State. And there's a long historical backstory, which I won't bore you with. It's largely Muslim. And Buddhist monks have promoted the idea that Muslims are demonic, they're murderous, they're rapists, it's the same old story. We find it again and again and again and again. But also they're subhuman. They breed like an invasive species of carp. They are reincarnations of vermin, and so on and so on and so on. So in both cases, we have the dehumanization of others as a sort of greasing the wheels of cruelty and atrocity.
I appreciate you sharing those examples. Unfortunately, you could have cited many more. And
I could have, yes.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that religion often does play a part. It can be used as a legitimating factor, including for Christianity. I think the Christian and evangelical audience needs to wrestle with that and come to grips with that, and stop and ask ourselves, how have we not lived up to the highest ideals of our own religious tradition? And how can we do that when dehumanization comes about? So let's shift to consideration of Christian history a little bit more, and how that has taken place. Can you share some examples historically of how
Oh, sure.
we've done that with Jews and so on? Can you speak to that?
Sure. And I'll give an extended example.
Okay.
But I first just would like to respond to something that you said.
Sure.
How can Christians whose ideals are very different become embroiled in this sort of practice? Well, the answer is very simple. Christians are human beings. And as human beings, we are vulnerable to this way of thinking. We're all cracked vessels, right?
Right.
We are unable to elevate ourselves beyond the human condition. So that's something we have to deal with. Okay, so this is an example I developed very extensively in my next book, which the publisher now is wanting to play around with the title, but the title will probably be called Making Monsters. And this has to do with Christian anti-Semitism, or rather the history of anti-Semitism in Europe and beyond. So, and please, cut me off if I'm going into too much historical detail. So, early on, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And whereas Christians had been persecuted before this point by pagans, at this point it starts shifting around and Christians start persecuting pagans. Now, Jews have a very peculiar position in this world because Jews aren't pagans, but they're not Christians. And they have a particular relationship. Judaism has a particular relationship to Christianity. So the really influential person in this early period was Augustine of Hippo, known to Catholics, of course, as Saint Augustine. And he argued that Jews should not be persecuted. They should be allowed to practice their religion, unlike pagans. But what the heck? Something just fell. Pardon me.
That's okay.
Okay. What was it? It sounded like it was back in your room. I was talking to my wife there.
Okay.
Okay. So, but live in a condition of degradation, right? And so the idea of preserving Jews was it would make good propaganda for converting pagans because it kind of testified to the historical bona fides of Christianity. So the relationship between Jews and Christians was pretty stable for a very, very long time. And whatever, there were some very anti-Semitic fathers of the church, but it probably really didn't affect relations between ordinary people, neighbor and so on. This begins to change at the end of the 11th century with the First Crusade. There were 3 waves of crusaders that went east to win back the Holy Land for Christianity from the Muslims. And the third of that wave decided, well, we'll kill the infidel within, and slaughtered lots of Jews. Many Jews committed suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Crusaders. Then, I'm kind of jumping over a lot of history, but the crucial period of history here is actually the 14th century. There had been growing racialization of Jews in Europe, mostly as a grassroots movement. So on the whole, the church made efforts to protect Jews, but there was a grassroots movement within Christianity, which they started to see Jews as an alien race, as maybe subhuman. There were all sorts of beliefs, like Jews had tails and they exuded a foul smell, and as it developed were satanic, in league with the devil, and so on. And this really, really got bad with the bubonic plague pandemic of the middle of the 14th century. Jews were accused of being in league with Muslims and trying to destroy Christianity by poisoning the water supplies, and that was the cause of the plague. And this is when the so-called blood libel really, really took off. It was an older idea, but Christians developed the idea that Jews engaged in human sacrifice, in particular, kidnapped Christian children, drained them of their blood, and mixed the blood with the matzah dough for the annual Passover meal. So this led to endless persecution, and in one form or another persisted. Now, this is very, very important. So initially, the demonic Jew was fundamentally a religiously toned idea in Christian Europe. Of course, in the Middle Ages, religion saturated everything, right? But it persisted and then was revived. It was revived by proto-fascist groups in the late 19th and early 20th century, one of which was the National Socialists. So the Nazis were in the aftermath of, it was really the aftermath of World War I, when populations were really under stress. Germany had been brought to its knees, was paying terrible reparations to France and the rest of the world. Many, many, many young men were dead or incapacitated from the war. And then there was the flu pandemic, right, sweeping through Europe. It was a terrible time. And when times are bad like that, these sorts of racist and dehumanizing ideologies start getting traction because people look for someone to blame. And so all of these medieval ideas were revived in Nazi propaganda. So Hitler in Mein Kampf talks about Jews as a plague. I mean, it's a revival of the bubonic plague charge. He talks about the Jewish disease. in Nazi speeches, you can see Jews as being described quite overtly as demonic, enemies of everything good and decent. And of course, then Jews became associated in Nazi propaganda with vermin, with disease-carrying vermin, with rats and with lice and with typhus. So there's that whole trajectory, which begins, it's very important, it begins with religious ideology, and then it spreads, it proliferates in a more secular context in the 20th century and beyond, because these ideas, which originated way back then within a Christian framework, at least an ostensibly Christian framework, are still very much alive, right? Once these things get rooted, you see, they don't go away very easily. So during the same period, from like the late 11th century, we also have the demonization of Muslims by Christians, right? Because all this stuff really starts with the First Crusade, right? And there, the literature is not as extensive, at least the literature that I have pursued, but Muslims are explicitly sometimes described as monstrous beings, monstrous evil beings. They're demonized. And of course, a lot of that stuff, unfortunately, is still around. So these groups of people with different religious practices and convictions are all too often conceived of and represented as evil, demonic or quasi-demonic beings. And that can often lead to bloodshed.
I think all of that is tremendously important to reflect upon. I think the idea of the monstrosity of the other, the religious other, is tremendously important. I work not only in interreligious conflict, but also monster theory, monster studies. In fact, I'm one of the co-editors for the peer-reviewed Journal of Gods and Monsters. And I would love to see a book that was done, maybe your book will be a step in that direction, that brings together monster theory and interreligious conflict and dehumanization. And it's important to remember that this is not just something that happened in the past. As a part of my grant research, we looked at metaphors that evangelicals were using to talk about religious others. And I'll just mention a few of those. If folks are interested, they can request a copy of this. Pat Robertson on the 700 Club referred to Muslims as a pathogen and infection. Again, Pat Robertson talked about Buddhists as a mild contagion we should stay away from. Janet Mefford on her show, Janet Mefford Today in 2012, in response to a Sikh giving a prayer at a Republican political gathering, referred to that as a syncretism that is kind of seeping under the door like a gas. So, in poison. Don Richardson, an evangelical author, referred to the Quran and its version as a food an assassin adds to poison as a disguise to disguise a deadly taste. We could go on and on. So there's the metaphors of disease, contagion, and then to connect to what you just said a few moments ago, there's both the metaphor of the demonic and literal demonization. Reverend Barry Vines on CNN. In 2002, Islam was founded by Muhammad, a demon-possessed pedophile who had 12 wives. So there's a literal demonization of the religious other. So these are all things within the broader evangelical Christian social media kind of thing.
That language, I mean, I hate to say it, but that language could come right out of Mein Kampf. It really could. There's a wonderful book by a scholar named Felicity Rash, R-A-S-H, about the metaphors in Mein Kampf. And you can just look that. I mean, it's indistinguishable. And that's scary stuff. Yeah.
So one of the concerns I have is that we then, as evangelicals, take these metaphors and they become a part of the theology, the way in which we baptize, if you will, negative attitudes, which paves the way for negative actions towards religious others.
Sure. Yeah, so these are not just ways of talking. They're not just ways of talking. if you use that sort of language, it encourages people to conceive of the other as less than human and as dangerously less than human. Look, here's something that's really important, I think, for all of us to understand, that by and large, the architects of genocide, genocidal violence, and similar forms of violence think of themselves as doing good. They think of themselves as ridding the world of evil. So having moral convictions isn't always a safeguard against performing profoundly, devastatingly immoral actions. And, you don't have to spill blood to harm people. You can contribute to an atmosphere in which in which blood is spilled, or an atmosphere in which people are diminished and they're inwardly hurt. And that comes very, very easy to us. So I think it's very, very extraordinarily important for evangelicals, but not only evangelicals, for all of us, right? I'm an atheist. It's just as important for me as it is to those whom I'm addressing now, to understand that as mere human beings, we are vulnerable to falling into these ways of talking and these ways of thinking, and therefore vulnerable to perpetrating harm, perpetrating wrong.
We've only got just a couple more minutes here with the time limitations of Zoom. Can you just take a couple of minutes and maybe add on expand a little bit? How can we be more aware of our dehumanization and take steps to rehumanize others?
Okay, so here's the first thing. Monsters aren't real. Monsters are fictional, right? When you start thinking of others as monsters, you're on fiction land. You're in fiction land. And even people who do terrible things, I mean, we're inclined to talk about Hitler as a monster, Stalin as a monster. No, they're not monsters, they're human beings. And I think the proper attitude towards them is to gaze into the mirror they hold up to us of what we are capable of. More broadly, we need to understand history properly, and it's not taught properly because all of us, whoever we are, our ancestors have blood on their hands. No group of people is immune from that. And once you recognize that, it's possible for us to do this again and again and again. So there's an inward looking and a commitment to recognizing our own vulnerability to dehumanizing ways of thinking. And part of that is understanding how our minds work that allows us to do these things. And I talk about that in the book. And the other is outward looking, to not be tolerant of this kind of destructive rhetoric which incites people to violence, to call out dangerous speech in one's own community, as well as in the community of others, and, be as morally committed to rectifying problems in one's own group as one is to rectifying those problems in the world at large.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. David, I appreciate it. I'm going to include a link to your fine book in the description for this podcast. We also included on our recommended book list at Multifaith Matters on our website.
Thank you.
As we try to address key challenges to evangelicals as we relate to a multi-faith world. Again, I thank you so much for your work.
And thank you for your work. This is very important work you're doing.
Great. Thank you so much, David.
Okay. Bye-bye now.